In 1513, a Turkish naval officer sat alone in a room in Constantinople, hunched over a sheet of dried sheepskin, tracing coastlines with an ink-stained hand. His name was Piri Reis. Outside, the city moved with the energy of an empire at its height, merchants, soldiers, the rattle of carts on stone. Inside that room, there was only silence, and the quiet scratch of a pen following the edge of something it should not have known. The documents piled around him were not his own creation. He had gathered them from traders, from sailors, from the ruins of libraries, fragments of charts so old their origins could not be traced, some possibly salvaged from Alexandria before fire swallowed its shelves. He wrote careful marginal notes as he worked, describing his sources in a tone almost apologetic in its honesty. He was not inventing, he was compiling. He was listening to something older than himself. There is a particular quality to the silence in a room where something impossible is being quietly assembled. Not the silence of emptiness, but of weight. The silence of a fact that does not yet have a name. Piri Reis may have understood what he was drawing as he worked by lamplight. Or perhaps he simply followed the charts he had inherited, trusting them the way a careful man trusts a well-made instrument without needing to understand how it was built. The map he completed that year still exists. It is housed in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. You can stand in front of it. You can look at it. And if you know what you are looking at, if you understand what the southern edge of that map depicts, and when it was drawn, the silence that surrounds it is not the silence of history. It is the silence of a question that has been waiting 500 years for someone to ask it seriously. What if everything we were taught about who discovered what, and when, and how is wrong? Set aside the atmosphere for a moment and look at the evidence directly, because the Piri Reis map rewards precision. The upper portion of the map depicts the Atlantic coastlines of Europe and West Africa, and these are accurate enough for the period impressive but explicable. The middle section shows South America, and here the precision begins to strain ordinary explanation. The longitudinal positioning of the South American coastline is more accurate than European cartographers were capable of producing for another 2 centuries. Measuring longitude reliably required clocks that were not invented until the 18th century. Piri Reis drew the coastline correctly without them. But it is the lower section of the map that changes everything. Below the South American continent, the map shows a continuous landmass running east to west along the bottom of the chart, a landmass that corresponds, in its general shape and position, to the coastline of Antarctica. Not Antarctica as it appears today, buried under miles of ice that has accumulated over thousands of years, but Antarctica as it would have looked during an earlier age, before the ice sheet formed, when its coastlines were exposed, habitable, and potentially navigable. In 1960, this detail was examined formally. Captain Lorenzo Burrows of the United States Air Force forwarded the Piri Reis map to the cartographic section of the Strategic Air Command for analysis. The response, documented in an official letter that has been reproduced in multiple academic works, concluded that the map showed subglacial geographic features of the Antarctic coastline that matched data produced by 20th century seismic surveys. Those surveys used instruments that did not exist in 1513, or in 1000 BCE, or in any era that mainstream history associates with Antarctic exploration. The first officially recognized sighting of Antarctica occurred in 1820. The last ice age ended approximately 12,000 years ago. Piri Reis himself wrote notes in the margins of his map, explaining that he had drawn it by compiling and cross-referencing a large number of source charts. Charts he described as being very old, some of which he believed derived from the era before classical Greek civilization. He was not claiming to have discovered anything. He was claiming to have inherited knowledge from people who came before him. And on the basis of what his map depicts, those people had been somewhere that no civilization on official record has any business being. The map is real. The Air Force letter is real. The Antarctic coastline under the ice matches. These are not disputed facts, they are documented ones. What is disputed is their meaning. And that dispute is where this story truly begins. Before we follow the evidence further, it is worth being honest about what mainstream history actually teaches and why it teaches it that way. The conventional account of pre-Columbian geography is not simply arrogance. It is grounded in a coherent framework. European navigators before the 15th century lacked reliable methods of measuring longitude at sea. Their ships, though seaworthy in coastal waters, were not designed with the deep ocean passage in mind. Their charts were regional, often fantastical in their depictions of distant coastlines, and riddled with blank spaces labelled with polite euphemisms for ignorance. The argument that meaningful transoceanic contact before Columbus was essentially impossible rests on real limitations, technological, institutional, and geographical. But that argument contains a foundational assumption that rarely gets examined openly, that absence of evidence in the Western academic record is equivalent to absence of the event itself. This is a logical error that no scientist would accept in any other domain, and yet it has quietly shaped the study of pre-Columbian history for 2 centuries. When explorers, merchants, and scholars from non-European civilizations recorded voyages to distant lands, those accounts were classified as mythology. When physical artifacts turned up in the wrong place at the wrong time, the explanation was contamination. When biological evidence pointed the wrong direction, the methodology was questioned. The bar of proof applied to pre-Columbian contact has been, in practice, set permanently above the level that any evidence could realistically clear. The reason for this is not difficult to understand. Records are destroyed, libraries burn. The Library of Alexandria, which at its height held several 100,000 papyrus scrolls, including geographical and navigational accounts from across the ancient world, was damaged and ultimately destroyed across several centuries of conflict. What was lost there can only be guessed at. But the losses from the Americas are even more staggering in their specificity. When the Spanish bishop Diego de Landa arrived in the Yucatan in the 16th century, he encountered a Maya civilization with a sophisticated written tradition. In a single afternoon in 1562, he oversaw the burning of every codex his soldiers could gather tens of thousands of books, centuries of accumulated astronomical, historical, medical, and geographical knowledge, reduced to ash in a day. Landa later wrote about this event with a puzzling mixture of satisfaction and regret. We will never know what was in those books. But some knowledge does not burn. Some knowledge is written in bones, and in genes, and in the chemical traces left in the tissues of the dead. Some knowledge is carved in stone in temples that have stood for 900 years. Some knowledge is preserved in the distribution of plants across oceans they were never supposed to cross, and in the structure of languages spoken by people who were never supposed to have met. This documentary follows that kind of knowledge, the kind that cannot be burned, forged, or conveniently misplaced. What we will encounter is not a theory. It is a collection of independently verified anomalies that, taken together, point toward a single conclusion. The ancient world was far more connected than we have been told, and the evidence has been hiding in plain sight all along. We will look at biology, genetics, botany, architecture, ancient texts, and the physical science of ocean currents. We will meet the researchers who spent careers on this material, often at significant professional cost. We will follow the logic where it leads not to comfort, but to accuracy. And by the time we are finished, the Piri Reis map will not look like a mystery anymore. It will look like a receipt. This documentary will not invoke ancient aliens. It will not claim that a single lost civilization built every pyramid on Earth. It will not present contested findings as settled facts, or settled facts as contested ones. What it will do is follow the evidence physical, biological, linguistic, genetic, architectural, and botanical, and ask only this: do these pieces, taken together, suggest a world more interconnected than our history books acknowledge? The academic controversy around pre-Columbian transoceanic contact is real, and it will be presented honestly. There are serious scholars on both sides of this question. Thor Heyerdahl spent his life building the physical case for Pacific contact. Alice Kehoe, a mainstream university anthropologist, has spent decades documenting the biological and archaeological evidence in peer-reviewed publications. Gunnar Thompson has catalogued hundreds of documented contact cases. These are not people with treasure maps. They are scientists with methods, sources, and published records. The story you are about to hear does not come from myths or legends, from television mysteries or tabloid archaeology. It comes from the ground itself, from the chemical composition of mummy tissue, from the genetic code of living populations, from the carved surfaces of ancient temples, From the officially documented findings of government analysts and university laboratories, every claim in this documentary has a source, a paper trail, a dig site, a laboratory result. What you are about to encounter is a collection of facts that, assembled together, point toward one conclusion that mainstream history has not yet found a comfortable way to absorb. The evidence is patient. It has been waiting a long time, and we are only beginning. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it the way your history teacher described it. Camel caravans moving in long, swaying lines across desert plateaus, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon and pepper and unwashed animal. Merchants speaking 5 languages at once in a single marketplace, Chinese silk arriving in Roman hands, Roman glass appearing in Chinese tombs. The Silk Road was not one road, but a system of roads, a web of routes connecting the civilizations of Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean, in a slow, continuous exchange of goods, ideas, and disease that shaped the ancient world more profoundly than any single war or empire. This history is real, documented, and extraordinary. It deserves to be honored before it is challenged. The network at its peak, roughly between 200 BCE and 200 CE, was of staggering complexity. No single merchant traveled the full route from China to Rome. Goods passed through relay traders, each carrying commodities through their own section of the web before handing them off at terminal markets. A bolt of silk from the workshops of Han Dynasty China might pass through a dozen hands in Parthia, Bactria, and the Levant before arriving on the back of a Roman senator's wife, who knew nothing about where it came from and cared only about how it looked in lamplight. This was the genius and the limitation of the system. It was vast and decentralized, and the further from the center you traveled, the stranger and more fragmentary the knowledge became. But the Silk Road, as most people understand it, is primarily an overland story. Its maritime extensions, the sea routes that branched off from coastal terminal cities and carried goods into waters, the standard narrative treats as peripheral, are less celebrated and far less understood. And it is along those maritime edges, in the less documented waters beyond the official boundaries of the known network, that the first cracks in the conventional story begin to appear. Roman coins have been found in Japan. Chinese porcelain has been excavated from sites in Zimbabwe. A golden Buddhist statue was unearthed in Sweden. The Silk Road was not a road, it was a web. And the question is not how far that web stretched, it is whether we have ever been told honestly where it ended. What scholars now recognize as the most active and underappreciated trade network of the ancient world was not the Silk Road at all. It was the Indian Ocean maritime system, a vast, seasonal, self-regulating highway of wind and water that carried goods and peoples across 3,000 miles of open ocean with a regularity and sophistication that European maritime technology would not match for another 1,000 years. The key to this system was the monsoon. Twice a year, predictably, the winds over the Indian Ocean reverse direction. Between April and September, they blow steadily from the southwest. Between October and March, they blow from the northeast. Ancient sailors, Arab, Indian, Persian, and Southeast Asian, understood this pattern so precisely that they built their entire commercial calendar around it. A merchant departing from the Persian Gulf in April could ride the southwest monsoon to the Malabar coast of India in 3 weeks, conduct his business through the summer, and ride the northeast monsoon home before the winter solstice. This was not primitive navigation by feel. It was meteorological science applied to commerce with a precision that modern airline scheduling would recognize. The scale of goods moving through this system is difficult to fully absorb. Cotton textiles from Gujarat, pepper and cardamom from Kerala, porcelain and silk from the workshops of Tang Dynasty China, frankincense and myrrh from the Arabian Peninsula, gold and ivory from the Swahili coast of East Africa, tin from the mines of southern India, glass from Persia. And everywhere, the movement of people, merchants, monks, pilgrims, scholars, and sailors who carried not just commodities, but languages, religions, mathematical systems, and agricultural knowledge across the water as casually as they carried pepper. The archaeological evidence for this network is rich and growing. The trading port of Mantai on the northern coast of Sri Lanka was excavated in the 1980s and found to contain artifacts from Rome, Persia, India, Southeast Asia, and China in the same archaeological layers, a material record of a world in conversation. Berenike, on the Egyptian Red Sea coast, yielded teak wood, which grows only in South and Southeast Asia, black pepper in remarkable quantities, and a Tamil inscription all dating to the 1st century CE. The Swahili coast cities of Kilwa, Mombasa, and Malindi grew wealthy, precisely because they sat at the southern extreme of this network, funneling East African gold and ivory into the broader web. But mixed into the material record of these trading ports in the plant remains, the textile fragments, the trace elements of ancient cargo, are things that should not be there. Botanical specimens from species whose native range, by every accepted record, lies not in Africa or Asia or Arabia, but in South America. These anomalies are small, easy to dismiss individually, almost impossible to dismiss collectively. They are the first whisper of something that the rest of this documentary will say much more loudly. The Indian Ocean was not the edge of the world, it was the center of it, and beyond its eastern and western shores the story continues. To understand why the conventional story of global isolation is so difficult to sustain, you need to understand what the Polynesians actually did. Beginning around 1500 BCE, and accelerating significantly after 1000 BCE, Polynesian seafarers navigated the largest ocean on Earth in vessels that Western historians spent centuries dismissing as coastal craft. They were not coastal craft. They were ocean-going double-hulled canoes, purpose-built for deep-water passage, crewed by people who had developed one of the most sophisticated navigational knowledge systems in human history. Without maps, without compasses, without written charts of any kind, Polynesian navigators settled Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, and hundreds of other islands across a triangle, spanning roughly 10 million square miles of open Pacific. They memorized the rising and setting points of more than 200 stars. They read wave patterns with their bodies, feeling through the hull of a moving vessel, the characteristic bends and deflections that form when ocean swells interact with a landmass below the horizon. They tracked bird migration routes, cloud formations, and the behavior of phosphorescent plankton in disturbed water. This was not guesswork. This was science observational, systematic, accumulated over generations, and transmitted with the precision of any written text. Modern experimental navigation has confirmed what the historical record implies. The Polynesian Voyaging Society's reconstruction of traditional vessels, most famously the Hokulea, which has sailed tens of thousands of miles using traditional navigation methods alone, proved that these journeys were not lucky accidents, but deliberate, repeatable feats of applied knowledge. When the Hokulea first sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976, without instruments, guided entirely by traditional navigation methods, its arrival was off target by less than 30 miles, after a journey of 2,700 miles. 30 miles. In the 15th century, the best European navigators could not match that accuracy in the Mediterranean. Now, consider what the genetic and botanical evidence tells us. A landmark 2020 study, published in Nature using genomic data from populations across dozens of Polynesian island groups, confirmed Native American genetic ancestry in Polynesian populations, specifically in the islands of eastern Polynesia, dating to approximately 1200 CE, 5 centuries before Columbus. The genetic signal is unambiguous. It could only have arrived through direct human contact between Polynesian seafarers and Native American populations on the South American coast. And then there is the sweet potato Ipomoea batatas, a plant with no wild relative outside the Americas, found in pre-Columbian Polynesian archaeological sites, across multiple island groups, dating back at least 700 years. This is not contested. This is in the peer-reviewed literature, accepted by the scientists who study it. The sweet potato crossed the Pacific before Columbus was born. Someone carried it. Someone made the journey. Having established what Polynesian navigators accomplished in the Pacific, turn the globe to its other face and pose the same question about the Atlantic. The immediate instinct is to resist the comparison the Atlantic is different, wider, more featureless, without the island chains that served as stepping stones in the Pacific. But this resistance is based on a misunderstanding of how ancient sailors actually navigated open ocean. They did not sail against the ocean, they sailed with it, and the Atlantic, like the Pacific, has a current system that amounts to a natural maritime highway. The North Atlantic Gyre runs clockwise, down the European and African coasts on the eastern side, across the equatorial Atlantic from east to west, and back north along the American coast. The South Atlantic Gyre mirrors it. A vessel placed in the water off the coast of West Africa, at the latitude of the Cape Verde Islands, and left to drift, will arrive on the Caribbean coast of the Americas in 3 to 6 weeks without sails, without navigation, without any human effort beyond staying afloat. This is not theory. This is oceanography. Ancient sailors who understood their coastal currents would not have needed to be long-distance theorists to discover this route. They would have needed only to follow it. In 1969 and 1970, the Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl made the point physically. He constructed a replica ocean vessel from papyrus reeds, the material used for boats in ancient Egypt and along the Nile, and sailed it from the coast of Morocco westward across the Atlantic. The first attempt, Ra the First, failed due to a structural problem. The second attempt, Ra II, sailed the full distance from Safi in Morocco to Barbados, over 3,000 miles in 57 days, arriving safely. The boat worked. The current carried it. The ancient Egyptians or North Africans who built vessels from papyrus reeds and who sailed the Nile and the Red Sea as a matter of routine had at their disposal a technology that could, in principle, have crossed the Atlantic along the current system. The distance is not the question. The question is whether we can continue to assume that no one, across thousands of years of seafaring, ever followed that current far enough to find out where it went. The case being built here is not yet that Atlantic crossings definitely occurred. That argument requires the biological and archaeological evidence of the chapters ahead. What is being established is simpler and harder to ignore. The ocean current systems of both the Atlantic and the Pacific constitute natural maritime highways that do not require extraordinary navigational skill to use. For a species that has been building boats and following coasts for at least 50,000 years, these routes were not impossible. They were inevitable. The only question is when someone first took them, and what they left behind when they arrived. In 1992, a German toxicologist named Dr. Svetlana Balabanova was conducting what she expected to be a routine study. Her laboratory at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Ulm had received samples from 9 mummified human remains held in the Egyptian Museum collection in Munich. The work was standard, a toxicological analysis to establish what substances were present in the preserved tissue, contributing to a broader picture of ancient Egyptian diet and pharmacology. Nobody in her team was thinking about the Americas. Nobody was looking for a scandal. When the results came back, Balabanova assumed there had been an error. The samples tested positive for cocaine metabolites, for nicotine, and for hashish. Cocaine and nicotine in 1992 meant one thing to a forensic toxicologist: South American plants. Cocaine derives from the coca leaf, which grows in the Andes. Nicotine derives from tobacco, also native to the Americas. Neither plant was supposed to exist in the Old World before 1492. The samples came from mummies dated to the New Kingdom period of ancient Egypt, some as old as 3,000 years. The presence of these compounds in mummified tissue, more than 3 millennia old, was, in the most literal scientific sense, impossible. She ran the tests again. Using different methodologies, she employed hair shaft analysis, which is not merely a surface test, but a forensic technique that examines the internal structure of the hair itself, capturing a longitudinal chemical record of what a person consumed over months and years. The same method used in modern courts to establish drug use history. The same method that cannot be explained away as post-mortem contamination, because contamination from the environment would appear only on the hair's outer surface, not embedded in its internal cortex. The results did not change. 9 mummies, cocaine, nicotine, hashish. Consistently, repeatedly, across multiple testing methods. Balabanova published her findings in 1,992 inches, the German journal Naturwissenschaften. The response from the Egyptological community was immediate and fierce. The mummies must be modern forgeries, some argued. The specimens must have been contaminated by museum handling. The methodology must be flawed. The accusations came rapidly and from credentialed sources. What was notably absent from these critiques was any actual replication of the testing using comparable rigor, a scientific refutation that matched the scientific claim. The rejection was more reflexive than methodical, which Balabanova noted with professional patience. Her response to her critics was not to retreat, it was to expand. If the initial 9 samples could be dismissed as a statistical accident or contamination event, what about a much larger and more diverse sample set? What about mummies from different periods, different preservation conditions, different museum collections, different geographic origins within Egypt? If the results held across all of those variables specifically designed to eliminate every proposed source of contamination, then the contamination argument would become not scientifically defensible but scientifically desperate. Balabanova's team began gathering samples. The answer they found would remove any comfortable middle ground from the debate. By the time Balabanova's expanded study was complete, the team had analyzed over 3,000 individual mummified specimens, not a handful of museum pieces, but a large, carefully stratified sample spanning multiple centuries of Egyptian history and multiple geographic regions within the Nile Valley. The findings were consistent. Cocaine and nicotine metabolites appeared in a significant percentage of the samples, distributed across different time periods and preservation contexts, in a pattern that could not be explained by a single contamination event. Independent laboratories in France and the United States subsequently obtained their own specimens from different museum collections and conducted separate analyses. Their results broadly corroborated Balabanova's findings. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the popular debate. The original 1,992 finding was not an isolated claim from a single eccentric laboratory. It was replicated, imperfectly, with smaller sample sizes, with some variation in methodology but replicated. The metabolites were present. The only question left was what they meant. Several competing hypotheses emerged from the academic discussion. The most conservative proposed that an extinct Old World plant, unknown to botany, might have contained alkaloids chemically similar to cocaine or nicotine, a plant that happened to produce the same metabolites that forensic chemistry associates exclusively with American species, and that happened to be used in ancient Egypt across multiple centuries, and that has since disappeared without leaving any botanical, textual, or agricultural trace whatsoever. The hypothesis is logically possible. It is also, in the judgment of most botanists who have considered it, staggeringly improbable. The more radical hypothesis is simpler. It requires no extinct mystery plant, no elaborate chemical coincidence, no untestable proposition. It requires only that the cocaine and tobacco found in the bodies of ancient Egyptians arrived the same way cocaine and tobacco arrived in the bodies of everyone else who ever used them, through direct contact with the plants that produce them. If those plants grew only in the Americas, then the contact had to be trans-oceanic. Dr. Alice Kehoe, in her detailed academic analysis of the Balabanova findings, concluded that the hairshaft data alone makes the contamination argument scientifically untenable. The evidence, she argued, is not an anomaly requiring explanation away. It is a finding requiring explanation. The story that genetics tells about pre-Columbian human contact is more complex and, in certain respects, more disturbing than anything the mummies revealed. It begins with a pattern in the mitochondrial DNA of Native American populations that has resisted explanation for more than 30 years. Human mitochondrial DNA is inherited only from mothers, passing unchanged from generation to generation, except for the occasional mutation that allows scientists to trace population lineages across thousands of years. The major mitochondrial haplogroups found in Native American populations, the genetic signatures that tell us where these people came from, are predominantly A, B, C, and D. All 4 have clear counterparts in East Asian and Siberian populations, consistent with the Bering Land Bridge migration model that explains how the Americas were first peopled during the last ice age. This part of the genetic story is coherent and well supported. Then there is haplogroup X. It appears in Native American populations of the Great Lakes region, the Ojibwe, the Sioux, the Nuchar-Nulth, at frequencies between 2 and 4%. It is present in some ancient skeletal remains from South America. What it is not present in is Siberia or East Asia, or any of the populations whose descendants are supposed to have crossed the Bering Land Bridge and peopled the Americas. Haplogroup X does appear, in significant concentrations, in populations in the Middle East, North Africa, and among the Druze of the Levant. Some researchers have proposed a separate Siberian X-bearing population as the explanation, but this hypothetical group has never been found in the genetic record. The distribution patterns strong in the Americas, strong in the Middle East and North Africa, essentially absent in the territory between points more naturally to an Atlantic crossing event of considerable antiquity. Meanwhile, on the Pacific side of the Americas, the genetics speak with greater clarity. The 2020 Nature study, conducted by a team, including researchers from Stanford University and the Institut Pasteur, analyzed genomic data from 23 Polynesian island populations and found unambiguous native American ancestry. The contact dated to approximately 1200 CE, and the signal was strongest in the eastern Polynesian islands closest to the South American coast. This was not a marginal statistical finding. It was a definitive identification of population contact that required physical meeting. The genetic material could not have drifted across the ocean by itself. More recently, and more tentatively, a 2023 genomic analysis of ancient skeletal material from the Canary Islands, the Atlantic archipelago, off the northwest African coast, found unexpected genetic markers suggesting possible contact with populations from the Caribbean region. The researchers were careful to present this as preliminary and incomplete, but the finding exists in the peer-reviewed literature, and its existence is itself significant. It suggests that the Atlantic genetic story may be as complex as the Pacific one, and that we are only beginning to have the tools to read it. Biology, taken across all of these domains, toxicology, population, genetics, ancient DNA, keeps pointing in the same direction, not loudly, not conspiratorially, but consistently, as a pattern. And patterns in science, when they persist across independent lines of evidence, do not go away by being ignored. Plants do not travel by themselves. They travel with people. When a plant appears on the wrong side of an ocean at the wrong point in history, it means someone carried it there in a seed pouch, in a handful of root cuttings, in the cargo of a vessel, making a journey that official history says did not happen. The botanical evidence for pre-columbian trans-oceanic contact is, in some ways, the most accessible and the most difficult to dismiss of all the evidence categories, because it is simultaneously physical, testable, and in several cases visible to anyone willing to look. Begin with the sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas. Its wild relatives grow only in the Andes of South America. Its first appearance in the Pacific archaeological record predates Columbus by at least 700 years, and genetic analysis of pre-Columbian Polynesian sweet potato varieties confirms their South American origin. This finding is not seriously contested by the scientists who study it. It is cited in mainstream botany journals. The sweet potato crossed the Pacific. Human beings carried it. The common bottle gourd Lagenaria caesarea presents a more complex picture. This plant appears in both American and African pre-Columbian archaeological deposits, and DNA analysis of ancient specimens has confirmed that the American and African lineages diverged from a common ancestor long before European contact was possible. The most parsimonious explanation, supported by the genetic data, is that gourds crossed the Atlantic in pre-Columbian times, possibly floating on currents, possibly transported by birds, possibly carried by people. The gourd evidence is murkier than the sweet potato evidence, but it points in the same direction. Then there are the temple carvings. In the state of Karnataka, in southern India, the Hoysala temples built during the 12th and 13th centuries are covered in an extraordinary profusion of carved detail. Thousands of figures, animals, plants, and decorative elements rendered with the precision of people who carved what they saw around them. Among these carvings, a number of botanical images have attracted intense scrutiny from ethnobotanists over the past 3 decades. The carved objects in question show rounded cobs covered in rows of tightly packed kernels, with leaf forms and husk structures that match the anatomy of Zea maize, corn with a specificity that ornamental abstraction cannot easily explain. Botanist Carl Johannesson, who spent 30 years documenting these images, published peer-reviewed analyses matching the carved kernel patterns against actual maize anatomy and arguing that no other plant in the Old World produces this combination of structural features. The objection that these carvings depict stylized lotus pods or pomegranates has been examined carefully and found insufficient. Neither the lotus nor the pomegranate produces the tight, regular, multi-row kernel arrangement visible in the carvings. The Hoysala temples have stood for 900 years. The carvings have always been there. If the botanical identification is correct, then someone who had seen maize, a plant that officially did not reach India until the 16th century, was carving it in stone in the 12th century. Not as an exotic import, as a familiar subject, as something common enough to decorate a sacred building with. These are not isolated anomalies. They are a pattern. And the pattern is trying to tell us something. Before the Maya, before the Aztec, before any of the civilizations that populate the standard account of ancient Mesoamerica, there were the Olmecs. They flourished along the Gulf Coast of what is now southern Mexico between roughly 1,500 and 400 BCE, and they did so with a sophistication that remains surprising even by the standards of civilizations we celebrate more openly. They built planned cities with monumental earthen pyramids, ceremonial plazas, and drainage systems. They developed what may be the earliest writing system in the Americas, and a calendar system that appears to have influenced and possibly preceded the better-known Maya versions. They traded jade, obsidian, and rubber across networks that spanned hundreds of miles. They were astronomers and engineers and administrators. And then, around 400 BCE, their civilization contracted and transformed in ways that archaeologists are still working to understand. What the Olmecs left behind, beyond their engineering and their calendar, are 17 colossal carved heads. They are made from basalt boulders, some weighing up to 50 tons, hauled from quarries 60 miles away through territory, with no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals larger than dogs. The smallest head stands taller than a grown man. The largest is nearly 3.5 meters from base to crown. Each one depicts a specific human face, wearing what appears to be a distinctive helmet. Each face is individual, not stylized or idealized, but particular, as if carved from a living model. When the first of these heads was described in academic literature in 1862 by the Mexican explorer José Melgar y Serrano, he noted something that subsequent observers have noted ever since. The facial features of the carved figures, the wide, flattened nostrils, the full lips, the rounded facial structure, bore a strong resemblance to the physiognomy of West African populations. Melgar himself wrote that the features were Ethiopian. He was using the 19th century term for sub-Saharan African. The observation has been contested, defended, dismissed, and re-examined in the century and a half since, without achieving anything like a settled consensus. What is not contested is the strangeness of the comparison in its historical context. The Olmec civilization predates Columbus by more than 1,000 years. The faces are not generic, they are specific portraits, carved by people who were almost certainly depicting individuals they knew or had been told to depict. And the features that multiple independent observers across different eras and different cultural backgrounds have identified as African are not a matter of artistic convention in Mesoamerica. They do not appear in Maya or Aztec sculpture, which developed after the Olmec tradition. Whatever the carved faces represent, they are not the default style of pre-Columbian Mexican art. They are something different, something specific, something that, if taken seriously, demands explanation. Between the 1960s and 1970s, the Polish physical anthropologist Andrzej Wyjaśński undertook one of the most systematic studies of pre-Columbian skeletal remains ever conducted. Working with excavated materials from major Olmec and early Mesoamerican burial sites, including Tlatilco, Monte Alban, and Cerro de las Mesas, he applied craniometric analysis to hundreds of specimens. Craniometry, in its modern application, is the precise measurement of skull dimensions and facial angles. It is a forensic and archaeological methodology used to characterize the morphological range of different population groups, with statistical methods that distinguish within group variation from between group differences. Wiercinski's findings, published in academic proceedings in the 1970s, were striking. A statistically significant proportion of the skulls he analyzed showed morphological characteristics consistent with West and Central African populations. Another proportion showed features associated with Pacific Island populations. Both of these groups were distinct from the primary morphological type derived from Northeast Asian migration, the type that dominates Native American skeletal populations generally. His conclusion was measured. He was not claiming that the majority of the Olmec population was African or Polynesian. He was observing that the population showed heterogeneity, a degree of morphological diversity that the standard single migration model did not account for. The academic response to Wiercinski's work was not refutation. There was no competing craniometric study that analyzed the same samples and produced contradictory results. What happened instead was the response that Thomas Kuhn would have recognized immediately. The findings were treated as an embarrassment, filed away, and excluded from the standard literature, not disproven. Ignored. Researchers who cited Wiercinski found their work marginalized by association. His papers remain in the academic record, unfalsified and unrefuted, and a 2021 ancient DNA analysis of Olmec-era skeletal remains, limited by the poor state of preservation in a tropical climate, found genetic markers suggesting population heterogeneity that the conventional migration model does not currently explain. The question that Wiercinski raised in the 1970s has not been answered. It has simply been avoided. The stone heads raise a visual question. The skeletal evidence raises a morphological one. What the cultural record raises is something more specific and more challenging. Not just the question of who was there, but the question of what they brought with them. In 2006, archaeologists working at a construction site in the Mexican state of Veracruz uncovered a stone block unlike anything previously found in the Americas. The Cascajal block, as it came to be known, is a serpentine tablet covered on one face with rows of carved symbols, 36 distinct glyphs arranged in a sequence that researchers immediately recognized as a written script. Dating to approximately 900 BCE, the Cascajal block is the oldest known writing system in the Western Hemisphere, predating all other known Mesoamerican scripts by several centuries. Its language has never been definitively deciphered. Nobody alive today knows what it says. But linguist Clyde Winters, working from a comparative analysis of the glyph forms, has argued controversially that the Cascajal symbols share structural characteristics with Proto-Mandis script from West Africa, specifically with the Vai syllabary and its hypothesized predecessors. This claim remains contested, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that. But it exists, it has been published, and it has not been formally disproven. Beyond the script question, a wider pattern of cultural parallels between Olmec civilization and West African cultures has been documented by researchers including Ivan van Sertima, whose 1976 book, They Came Before Columbus, catalogued these correspondences in detail that sparked decades of debate. The methodological danger in cultural comparison arguments is real and worth stating plainly. When you look hard enough, you can find superficial similarities between any two unconnected traditions, and the history of diffusionist scholarship is littered with overreach. With that caveat stated, certain correspondences are specific enough to demand attention. The serpent deity appears in Olmec religion as a central, recurring figure connected to water, fertility, and the underworld, bearing the same cosmological weight that serpent deities carry in Yoruba, Dahomey, and other West African religious traditions. The practice of ritual bloodletting associated with agricultural fertility appears in both traditions. The jaguar, as a sacred animal connected to rain and the watery underworld, has no obvious Old World counterpart, unless you look at the leopard deity complexes of West and Central Africa, where the spotted feline occupies precisely the same cosmological position. The ceremonial mound as the center of sacred space appears in both traditions, with similar alignments to astronomical events. None of these parallels, considered individually, constitute proof of contact. But in 1974, archaeologists excavating a buried offering cache at the Olmec site of La Venta found something that individual parallels cannot explain away. 16 small clay figurines had been arranged in a precise ceremonial grouping, apparently representing a specific ritual scene or narrative, buried deliberately in a formation that was meant to be meaningful. 15 of the figurines shared a consistent physical type, the same body proportions, the same facial structure, the same artistic vocabulary. The 16th was different, taller, different in proportion, distinct in its facial rendering. It stood at a slight remove from the group, positioned as if arriving from outside, as if representing someone who had come from somewhere else. Whoever buried that arrangement knew the difference. They preserved it in clay. They buried it carefully. Nobody has officially asked why. The cumulative weight of these observations, the heads, the bones, the script comparisons, the cultural parallels. The singular figurine does not constitute a proven case for sustained African contact with Olmec civilization, but it constitutes something that demands serious investigation rather than reflexive dismissal. The evidence is there. The investigation so far has largely not been. Turn now from the Atlantic face of this question to the Pacific one, where the evidence is in some respects more specific and in others more deeply embedded in the mainstream scientific record. The same pattern that emerges from the African-Mesoamerican comparison, cultural parallels too specific to be comfortable. Biological evidence that doesn't fit the standard model appears on the Pacific side of the Americas as well, with a different set of civilizations involved and a different but equally challenging set of facts. In the early 1960s, archaeologist Betty Meggers published an analysis that ignited a controversy that has not fully resolved in the 60 years since. Meggers observed that the Valdivia pottery tradition of coastal Ecuador, dating to approximately 3000 BCE, making it among the oldest ceramics in the Americas, showed extraordinary similarity to the Jomon pottery tradition of Japan from the same period. The similarity was not limited to the fact that both traditions were making clay pots. The specific shapes, the particular forms of the rims, the surface treatment techniques, the decorative vocabularies matched so closely that when photographs of the two traditions were displayed side by side without labels, trained ceramicists consistently struggled to distinguish them. Meggers proposed that Japanese Jomon fishermen, blown off course in the Kuroshio Current, the Pacific equivalent of the Atlantic Gyre, had reached the coast of Ecuador and transmitted their ceramic technology. The proposal was immediately attacked, and the debate over Valdivia Jomon contact remains unresolved. But the similarity of the pots has never been satisfactorily explained by independent invention. Then there is the chicken. The domestic chicken Gallus. Gallus domesticus is a native of Southeast Asia. It was domesticated in what is now Thailand and southern China, and was not present in the Americas, according to any pre-Columbian zoological record that accepts only post-Columbian introduction. Except that it was. In 2007, a team of archaeologists published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences the results of their excavation at the El Arenal site in Chile, radiocarbon-dated chicken bones found in pre-Columbian deposits, producing dates that place them firmly before European arrival in the Americas. The bones were also analyzed for a genetic marker specific to Asian chicken lineages rather than post-Columbian European introductions. They matched pre-Columbian chickens in Chile, Asian genetics, predating Columbus. This finding generated controversy, as everything in this field generates controversy, and subsequent debate has focused on questions of sample contamination and dating precision. But the original research team stands by its findings, which have been published in a peer-reviewed journal and have not been formally retracted. Somebody brought chickens from Southeast Asia to South America before Columbus was born. The bird didn't swim. Someone carried it across the Pacific in a boat. And that someone, whoever they were, represents exactly the kind of contact that the conventional historical narrative insists could not have happened. The chicken, sitting in a lab drawer in Santiago, disagrees. Across the ancient world, in every civilization that left substantial physical remains, the most important buildings were not palaces or granaries. They were temples. And temples, in ancient cultures, were never merely buildings. They were cosmological statements, architectural expressions of a civilization's understanding of the universe, its relationship to the movements of the sky, its theory of where time comes from and where it goes. They were built to last, not because the builders were conservative, but because the knowledge encoded in them was considered too important to lose. Stone was chosen over wood and mud brick, for the same reason that we carve important things rather than writing them, because stone remembers. The pyramid is the most famous example of this architectural impulse, and its global distribution is one of the most visually arresting facts in the entire debate about ancient cross-cultural contact. Stepped pyramid structures appear in Egypt, in Sudan, in Mesoamerica, in Cambodia, in Indonesia, in China, and in ancient Greece, whose pyramid at Hellinikon is rarely mentioned in Western architectural history. The standard explanation for this distribution is that a stepped pyramid is simply the most stable way to build a tall structure using heavy stones without metal reinforcement. There is truth in this. Structural logic does favor the pyramid form, and independent invention across cultures is certainly possible for basic shapes. But the argument from structural logic dissolves when you move from the shapes themselves to what is encoded inside them. The Great Pyramid of Giza encodes the mathematical constant pi in the ratio of its base perimeter to its height. Its outer casing dimensions, when calculated in the ancient Egyptian royal cubit, encode the dimensions of the Earth itself at the equator with an accuracy that was not matched by Western science until the 19th century. The pyramid complex at Teotihuacan in Mexico encodes not only pi, but the orbital periods of Venus and Mercury, and the dimensions of Earth's surface in units of measurement that are independently derived from the same physical constants. These are not simple pyramid shapes. These are precision instruments for encoding mathematical and astronomical knowledge in permanent form. The probability that two separate civilizations, with no contact, independently chose to encode the same mathematical constants in the same architectural form is a question worth pausing on. Before the temples, there were the stories. And the stories, when examined across the ancient world, show a pattern of correspondence that is difficult to file comfortably under the heading of coincidence. The flood myth appears in more than 200 distinct cultural traditions across every populated continent. In the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, written more than 4,000 years ago, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by a god to build a vessel, load it with animals and his family, and survive a world-destroying flood. In the Hebrew tradition, the same story is told about Noah. In India, the Matsya narrative records how the god Vishnu, in the form of a fish, warned the sage Manu to build a boat and preserve life through the deluge. In Greece, Deucalion survives the flood sent by Zeus. In Mexico, the Codex traditions of the Maya describe a world destroyed by water and a chosen survivor who preserves the seeds of life. In the Australian Aboriginal tradition, ancestral stories of catastrophic inundation describe coastlines swallowed by rising seas. The correspondences go beyond the presence of water. In many versions, a divine being warns a chosen human, who then preserves life and repopulates the earth afterward. Geologists have now confirmed that catastrophic coastal flooding events did occur at the end of the last ice age, as sea levels rose by nearly 400 feet over thousands of years, which provides the geological substrate for a shared human memory. But the specific narrative structure, the warning, the chosen survivor, the vessel, the recreation, is too consistent to be explained solely by shared geological experience. More specific still is the feathered serpent deity. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl is a serpent with feathers, connected to water, wind, creation, and divine knowledge. In India, the Naga serpentine deities associated with water and cosmic order are sometimes depicted with feathered or winged attributes. In Egypt, the uraeus, the sacred cobra of pharaonic iconography, is associated with divine protection and royal authority. In China, the dragon combines the serpent body with scaled or feathered attributes and is associated with water, wisdom, and celestial power. In the Australian Aboriginal tradition, the rainbow serpent is the foundational creative deity, associated with water and the origin of life. A feathered serpent connected to water and creation. On every continent. In cultures that mainstream history insists had no contact with one another. The two explanations on offer are independent invention and transmission. Independent invention is always possible, and the serpent is a universal image in human experience. It is present everywhere, in every environment, and its symbolic power is obvious. But the specific combination serpent plus bird plus water plus creation plus wisdom is precise enough to suggest that something more than convergent imagination is at work. Myths, like plants, do not travel by themselves. If the shared myths are suggestive and the shared pyramid forms are provocative, the shared astronomical alignments encoded in ancient temple complexes are, in the judgment of a growing number of researchers, the most compelling evidence of shared cosmological knowledge across cultures with no officially recognized contact. Begin with Giza because it is the most thoroughly studied. In 1994, researcher Robert Bauval published an analysis of the layout of the three main Giza pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, observing that their spatial arrangement mirrors the three belt stars of the Orion constellation with remarkable precision, including the slight offset of the smallest pyramid, Menkaure, that mirrors the slight positional offset of the third belt star, Mintaka, relative to the other two. The alignment corresponds not to the position of Orion in the sky in any historical period of known Egyptian civilization, but to its position as seen from Earth at approximately 10,500 BCE, well before the Old Kingdom. Bauval's work is not universally accepted, and serious criticisms of his methodology exist. But the correspondence of the three pyramids to the three belt stars is visually unambiguous, and the date calculation from the astronomical alignment has been independently verified. Now, travel to Cambodia. The temple complex of Angkor, built between the 9th and 13th centuries CE and covering an area larger than modern Paris, has been analysed by several researchers, including John Grigsby, who found that the layout of the major Angkor temples mirrors the configuration of the stars in the constellation Draco, with the relative positions, sizes, and angular relationships of the temples corresponding to those of the stars with a precision that exceeds what random placement would produce. The Draco constellation, notably, was the pole star constellation in the northern hemisphere at approximately 10,500 BCE, the same date that emerges from the Giza analysis. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, the three main pyramidal structures, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, and the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, are also astronomically aligned, and the complex as a whole encodes the orbital periods of multiple planets with mathematical precision that independent researchers have confirmed. 3 civilizations, 3 continents, 3 pyramid complexes, 3 sky maps encoded in stone. And in the astronomical alignment analysis of 2 of the 3 Giza and Angkor, the same date emerges. The sky, as it appeared from Earth around 10,500 BCE. Researchers who have noticed this convergence do not claim it as proof of direct contact. They claim it as evidence of a shared astronomical tradition of considerable antiquity. The origin of that tradition is one of the deepest unresolved questions in the archaeology of ancient knowledge. To understand why so much of the physical evidence for ancient maritime civilization is missing, you need to understand what happened to the world's coastlines at the end of the last ice age. Between about 14,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the vast ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere melted, global sea levels rose by nearly 400 feet. The coastlines that exist today are not the coastlines that ancient peoples knew. The habitable coastal plains of the ancient world, the fertile lowlands where fishing communities, port towns, and maritime trade centres would naturally have developed, were progressively swallowed by the rising ocean. This is not archaeology's speculation. It is marine geology's established fact, and its implications for the study of ancient maritime civilization are enormous. If the most sophisticated maritime cultures of the ancient world built their ports, their shipyards, their navigational schools, and their cartographic traditions along the coastlines that existed before the sea level rise, then the physical record of those institutions is now underwater, in many cases, under hundreds of feet of water, in regions that have never been systematically surveyed for archaeological material. Marine archaeologists have already begun finding traces. The ruins of Dwarka, off India's Gujarat coast, a city described in ancient Sanskrit texts as a real historical site, have been identified at depths of 30 to 40 meters by Dr. S.R. Rao's underwater surveys, revealing stone structures, pottery, and what appears to be an organized urban layout. The Yonaguni Monument, off the coast of Japan, a series of geometric stone formations at depths of 5 to 30 meters, with right angles, flat surfaces, and apparent staircases that some researchers argue cannot be naturally occurring, remains controversial, but its existence as a geological or archaeological anomaly is undisputed. Ancient material from Paleolithic coastal settlements has been recovered from the submerged continental shelves of the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Australian coast. The people who drew the original source maps that Piri Reis incorporated into his 1513 compilation may have been the last echo of a far older cartographic tradition, one that originated along coastlines the sea has since taken back. We have been searching for the evidence of ancient maritime civilization on dry land, in museums, in desert sites preserved by accident and aridity. Most of it is not on dry land anymore. Most of it is on the seafloor, waiting for the technology and the institutional will to find it. Among the most underexplored bodies of evidence in the Trans-Oceanic contact debate is the textual record of the ancient world. Not myths and legends, which are always dismissible, but technical literature, administrative manuals, engineering texts, commercial codes that describes, in the dry language of practical knowledge, maritime capabilities that Western historiography has consistently refused to take at face value. The Arthashastra of Kautilya, composed in the 4th century BCE and attributed to the chief minister of the Maurya Empire, is one of the most sophisticated political and economic treatises of the ancient world. Western scholars know it, primarily for its political philosophy. It has been compared to Machiavelli's Prince. What is less known is that it contains a detailed chapter on maritime administration, the classification of different types of ocean-going vessels by size and function, the organization of naval fleets for commercial and military purposes, the regulation of port procedures, and the management of long-distance maritime trade. The level of institutional detail implies not just the existence of ocean-going vessels, but an entire commercial infrastructure built around them: port authorities, ship manifests, customs procedures, insurance mechanisms. The Yuktikalpataru, a Sanskrit text on shipbuilding, whose precise dating is debated, but which is believed to encode knowledge from at least the early medieval period, describes multiple classes of vessels in engineering terms, specific enough that naval historians have produced scale drawings from its specifications. The largest vessels described are capable, by the text's own dimensions, of carrying hundreds of passengers and tons of cargo on extended ocean voyages. These are not coastal fishing craft. The word for these large ocean-going ships in the Yuktikalpataru is derived from the Sanskrit root for crossing the ocean, a term that implies not just technical capability, but cultural identity organized around open water navigation. The archaeological confirmation that Indian Ocean trade operated at this scale came in 1998, when the Belitung wreck was raised from the sea floor off the coast of Indonesia. A Tang Dynasty Chinese ship, it carried over 60,000 pieces of Chinese ceramics bowls, ewers, storage jars along with gold and silver objects, all destined for markets in West Asia. The ship sank around 826 CE. Its existence proved that individual commercial voyages in the Indian Ocean were carrying cargo volumes comparable to those of 18th century European East India Company ships. This was not marginal trade. It was industrial-scale commerce. The Vedic geographical literature speaks of lands beyond both the eastern and western oceans, Uttarakuru to the north and east, Swarnadweepa, the island of gold, to the southeast. Lands described with enough specific detail that later scholars have attempted to match them to actual geographies. Some of these descriptions fit the Indonesian archipelago too well to be coincidence. Others have been matched to landmasses further east. Whether these texts encode actual geographical knowledge or mythological geography is a question whose answer, pending further investigation, remains genuinely open. Among the official historical records of Imperial China is a document that, if its contents were taken seriously by Western scholars, would have rewritten the conventional account of pre-Columbian contact decades ago. The Liang Shu, one of the official dynastic histories of China, compiled by court historians in the 7th century CE from earlier official sources, contains a chapter recording the account of a Buddhist monk named Hui Shen, who appeared before the court of Emperor Wu of Liang in 499 CE with a remarkable story. Huishen described a land he called Fusang, located approximately 20,000 Chinese li to the east, a measurement that, using standard li conversions, places the destination approximately 7,000 miles from China's eastern coast. He had spent, by his account, 40 years there, teaching Buddhism to the local people and observing their civilization in careful detail. His descriptions include a tree called Fusang whose bark was used to make cloth and paper, a description that matches agave, native to Mexico, which was used for exactly these purposes by Mesoamerican peoples, deer that were kept in a semi-domesticated state, consistent with practices documented among North American indigenous groups, an absence of iron, but the presence of copper, which matches the pre-iron using civilizations of Mesoamerica, and a hierarchical political system with defined noble classes. The French sinologist Charles de Ginz, in the 18th century, was the first Western scholar to argue that Fusang referred to Mesoamerica. The geographic distance matches, the botanical descriptions match, the metallurgical description matches, the cultural details match. The official Chinese text has always been there, in the imperial archives, but Western historiography classified it as a confused account of Japan or some Pacific island, and the conversation moved on. Physical evidence supporting Chinese Pacific contact has emerged from other sources as well. In the 1970s, California state archaeologist James Moriarty analyzed a series of stone anchoring weights recovered from the seafloor off Palos Verdes, California. The stones were not made from any rock type found in North America. Their composition matched stone quarried in Asia. Their shape, a particular T-form design, matched anchoring technology, documented in ancient Chinese maritime archaeology, but not in any Native American coastal tradition. They were dated, by their incrustation and the sediment layers from which they were recovered, to a period well before European contact on the Pacific coast. The Chinese evidence, the Liangshu account, the anomalous anchor stones, and the broader context of the Zheng He voyages of the early 15th century, which brought Chinese fleets to East Africa and India on a scale that European exploration would not match for another century, paints a picture of a maritime civilization with both the capability and the institutional habit. Extended ocean exploration. The claim is not that China colonized the Americas. It is that over 2,000 years of active Pacific maritime culture, contact with the American coast was not merely possible, but probable. The tradition of Islamic geographical scholarship that flourished between the 8th and 14th centuries CE produced some of the most sophisticated and accurate geographical knowledge of the medieval world, and it is almost entirely absent from Western popular discussions of ancient exploration. This absence is its own kind of evidence. The erasure of non-European intellectual traditions from the history of geographical knowledge has made the world seem smaller and more isolated than the historical record actually supports. Muhammad al-Idrisi, working under the patronage of the Norman King Roger II of Sicily in 1154 CE, produced a map of the known world that was, by any measure of comparative accuracy, the finest cartographic achievement of its era. His world map remained more accurate than competing European maps for several centuries. It was based not on speculation or mythology, but on systematic collection of accounts from traders, diplomats, and travelers across a network that spanned from sub-Saharan Africa to East Asia. Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, writing in 1030 CE, calculated the circumference of the Earth with an accuracy within 1% of the actual measurement, an achievement that European science would not match for another 5 centuries. These were not isolated geniuses. They were products of an intellectual tradition that took the systematic knowledge of geography seriously. Within this tradition are scattered accounts of ocean exploration that have received insufficient scholarly attention. Arab geographical texts from the 9th and 10th centuries describe islands far to the west of Africa, the islands of the Blessed, the Sea of Darkness, with navigational descriptions and environmental details that some researchers have matched to the Canary Islands and possibly to Atlantic islands further west. The Arabic term for the Western Atlantic, Bahr al-Zulmat, the Sea of Darkness, implies a body of water that was known but feared, not one that was simply unknown. You name what you can imagine reaching. you fear what you have heard stories about. But the most extraordinary account in the Arab geographical record is preserved by the 14th century Malian scholar and historian Ibn Fadl Allah al-Umari, who recorded events from the court of the Mali Empire. He describes, in the section concerning Mansa Abu Bakr II, the Emperor of Mali, who preceded the famous Mansa Musa, an extraordinary maritime expedition. Around 1311 CE, the emperor assembled a fleet of 2,000 vessels, canoes, and supply boats, and launched them into the Atlantic Ocean, sailing west. He led the expedition himself. He was never seen again. The fleet did not return. His successor, Mansa Musa, confirmed the account when he visited Cairo in 1324 CE, describing how his predecessor had sailed into the ocean in search of what lay beyond the horizon. Mansa Abu Bakr II was one of the wealthiest rulers in the world at the time of his expedition, commanding an empire whose gold supply represented a substantial portion of global reserves. He had access to the finest shipbuilders on the West African coast, whose vessels routinely navigated the Atlantic waters off Senegambia and the Canary Islands. The Atlantic current system from that coast leads directly to the Caribbean. He disappeared. History moved on, but the current did not. Language is the hardest evidence to forge, and the most durable form of cultural transmission the human species has ever developed. A physical artifact can be contaminated, misattributed, or faked. A bone can be misidentified. A plant can, in extreme cases, be explained away by appeals to unverified botanical knowledge. But a word, embedded in the grammar and phonology of a living language spoken by thousands of people, cannot be planted or fabricated after the fact. When languages share vocabulary across oceans, those words made the crossing with human beings. The foundational principle of historical linguistics is straightforward. When two languages share words that cannot be explained by borrowing after documented contact, and when the probability of coincidental similarity can be calculated and shown to be extremely low, because languages have specific sound inventories and grammatical constraints that make true coincidence rare and measurable, then the shared vocabulary points either to common ancestry or to direct transmission. Neither of these explanations is comfortable when the languages in question are separated by several thousand miles of ocean. Researcher Enrico Matijevich, a Peruvian physicist with a background in comparative linguistics, published a study mapping vocabulary correspondences between Sanskrit and ancient Quechua, the language of the Inca Empire. The correspondences he documented were not limited to a handful of superficially similar sounds. They extended to basic vocabulary categories: terms for body parts, kinship relationships, cardinal numbers, and deity names, categories that linguists specifically use to test for deep historical connection, because they are the most resistant to borrowing and the least likely to correspond by chance. His analysis has been contested, as all work in this area inevitably is, but the correspondences he documented have not been satisfactorily explained by coincidence. More recently, and with academic support that is harder to dismiss, linguist Nancy Yor Davis of the University of Alaska, published through the University of Nebraska Press, an academic publisher, not a popular press, a book presenting her research on the relationship between the Zuni language of New Mexico and medieval Japanese. Davis documented a statistically significant number of lexical and grammatical correspondences between Zuni and Japanese, specifically concentrated in the vocabulary of religious ceremony, cardinal directions, and cosmological concepts. Her analysis proposed contact in the 13th century CE, consistent with the period of Japanese maritime expansion under the Kamakura shogunate. The academic response to her work was muted, rather than actively hostile, which in this field, as we will see in the next chapter, is often the most effective form of suppression. What linguistic evidence adds to the biological, botanical, and physical evidence catalogued in the preceding chapters is a dimension of human intentionality. Plants can be carried accidentally. Genes can be transmitted through brief, unrecorded contact. But shared sacred vocabulary, the words for gods, for directions, for the structure of the cosmos, is transmitted deliberately, through teaching, through sustained interaction, through the kind of extended contact that leaves marks in the deepest layers of a people's cultural memory. When those words appear on both sides of an ocean, somebody took them there on purpose. 6 chapters of evidence: biology, genetics, botany, architecture, astronomy, ancient texts, linguistics, peer-reviewed findings, official government letters, published academic books from university presses, and yet none of it is in the high school history textbook. The natural question, and it is a fair one, deserving a serious answer rather than a conspiratorial one, is why. What is the mechanism that keeps evidence of this quality out of the mainstream historical narrative? The answer is not a shadowy cabal of powerful people suppressing the truth. It is something far more ordinary, and in its ordinariness, far more difficult to fix. In 1962, the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn published a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions that changed how we understand the relationship between evidence and scientific belief. Kuhn's central insight was this: scientists do not behave like the idealized figures in science textbooks, calmly evaluating evidence and updating their beliefs accordingly. They behave like human beings, which is to say that their interpretation of new evidence is powerfully shaped by the theoretical framework, the paradigm within which they were trained. Anomalous findings, results that don't fit the dominant model, are not experienced as exciting challenges. They are experienced as threats. And the initial response of a scientific community to a threatening anomaly is not to revise the model, it is to question the anomaly. Apply this directly to the archaeology of pre-Columbian contact. The dominant paradigm, call it Columbian exceptionalism, holds that the Columbus 1492 voyage represented the first meaningful contact between the Old and New Worlds, with the single exception of Norse settlement at Lens aux Meadows around 1000 CE, which was itself dismissed as impossible for decades until physical excavation made denial impossible. This paradigm has been the organizing framework of New World archaeology since the 19th century. It shapes what research questions get funded, what findings get published, and what anomalies get classified as contamination rather than evidence. A graduate student who submits a dissertation proposing pre-Columbian Trans-Oceanic contact is not merely advancing an unconventional hypothesis, they are threatening the foundational premise of their entire field. Their committee knows this. They know this. And the institutional pressure to find alternative explanations for anomalous findings is enormous. This is not conspiracy. This is sociology. Kuhn documented the same pattern in physics, in geology, in medicine, in every scientific field where a paradigm had calcified around a specific model of the world. The paradigm protects itself not through active suppression, but through the distributed operation of peer review, funding allocation, hiring decisions, and editorial judgment, all of which systematically favor work that confirms the dominant model and systematically disadvantage work that challenges it. The scientists involved are not villains. They are people acting rationally within an institutional system that rewards consistency and punishes disruption. The result is a field in which the evidence is allowed to accumulate in journals and drawer files while the textbooks remain unchanged. The institutional resistance to trans-oceanic contact evidence is not purely a matter of scientific conservatism. It has a political dimension that is older than the academic institutions that now maintain it, and understanding that dimension is essential to understanding why this particular paradigm has been so remarkably durable. The story of Columbus as the discoverer of the Americas, a story that every American child learns and that structures the conventional account of the modern world's origins, was not an immediate or obvious historical consensus. Columbus himself died believing he had reached Asia. The elevation of 1492 as the founding moment of the modern world was a deliberate cultural construction of the 19th century, most powerfully embodied in Washington Irving's 1828 biography of Columbus, which romantically embellished the explorer's story to the point of fabrication. Irving invented the story that Columbus sailed to prove the earth was round, a story with no basis in historical fact, since educated Europeans had known the earth was round since ancient Greece. He invented it because it made Columbus seem more heroic, and heroism was what the newly formed United States needed from its founding mythology. The political utility of the Columbus narrative was not accidental. A founding story in which a European sailor arrives at an empty or primitive new world and inaugurates civilization serves specific ideological purposes. It frames the subsequent displacement of indigenous peoples as part of a natural historical progression rather than a conquest. It centers European agency in the creation of the modern world, and it implicitly denies the pre-Columbian Americas any meaningful connection to the broader flow of human history. To acknowledge that West African sailors, or Phoenician merchants, or Chinese Buddhist monks had been in the Americas centuries or millennia before Columbus would not merely revise a history lesson. It would fundamentally challenge the mythology that several national identities built themselves upon. This is not a claim that historians are consciously protecting a political agenda. It is an observation that certain historical narratives become so deeply embedded in cultural and national identity that their revision feels emotionally, socially, institutionally, like a threat to something more important than accuracy. The Columbus myth is one of those narratives. Its persistence is not a scientific judgment. It is a political one, dressed in the language of science. Abstract institutional analysis explains the general pattern of resistance. What makes that pattern concrete and specific are the individual cases, the specific instances where pre-Columbian contact evidence was found, documented, and then subjected to institutional pressure that prevented it from entering the mainstream record. 4 cases, among many, illustrate the mechanism with particular clarity. In 1996, a skeleton was unearthed from the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. The remains, dated by radiocarbon analysis to approximately 9,200 years ago, were turned over to forensic anthropologist James Chatters for preliminary assessment. Chatters's analysis of the skull morphology found features that he described as inconsistent with the standard morphological profile of populations derived from the Bering Land Bridge migration, specifically a longer, narrower skull with facial angles more closely resembling Polynesian or South Asian populations than the broad-faced Northeast Asian type expected. Subsequent DNA analysis, conducted in 2015, found that Kennewick man was most closely related to contemporary Native American populations, complicating rather than resolving the morphological puzzle. But the decade-long legal battle over access to the remains, during which the Army Corps of Engineers effectively sealed them from scientific study, ensured that the full range of analysis was never completed. In 1972, a Spanish archaeologist named José Cruxent reported recovering ancient amphorae, distinctive sealed ceramic storage vessels from the sea floor of a bay off the coast of Venezuela. Roman amphorae, dated by ceramic analysis to approximately 300 CE. Cruxent presented his findings and the Smithsonian Institution dispatched a research team to investigate. That team confirmed the antiquity of the material. And then the investigation stopped. No further funding was allocated. No follow-up expedition was organized. The report exists in the academic literature. The amphorae exist in a museum. The follow-up investigation has never happened. The Newport Tower in Rhode Island is a circular stone structure that has stood in the center of Newport for as long as any written record of the area extends. Its architectural characteristics, the specific proportions of its arches, its mortar composition, distinct from colonial-era New England masonry, and its dimensional measurements match Norse or possibly Templar construction techniques rather than anything documented in colonial American carpentry. Radiocarbon dating of plant material embedded in the original mortar has produced dates predating the earliest English settlements in the area. Mainstream American archaeology has consistently declined to fund a comprehensive investigation. None of these cases is individually conclusive. Each one has potential alternative explanations that a determined skeptic can construct. But the pattern they form together, a pattern of found evidence, confirmed antiquity, institutional discomfort, and abandoned investigation, is the pattern that Kuhn's model predicts. The anomalies are acknowledged, and then, quietly, not pursued. The evidence accumulates not in textbooks, but in drawer files, waiting. Against the institutional resistance, there are the researchers, not treasure hunters or television personalities, but credentialed scientists and scholars who spent careers building the case for pre-Columbian contact in the face of an academic culture that ranged from indifferent to actively hostile. Their work deserves recognition not as hagiography, but as a record of what sustained scientific inquiry looks like when it operates outside the warmth of institutional approval. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer and ethnologist, spent much of his career making the physical case for trans-oceanic contact. His 1,947 Kon-Tiki voyage, a raft from Peru to Polynesia, and his later Ra expeditions across the Atlantic were not stunts. They were empirical tests of specific hypotheses about ancient maritime capability, conducted at considerable personal risk and documented with scientific rigor. His work won a Nobel Prize nomination and influenced generations of researchers. It is still regularly dismissed by archaeologists who confuse the demonstration of physical possibility with the proof of historical fact, a confusion that conveniently exempts them from engaging with what his voyages actually showed. Alice Kehoe, Professor Emerita at Marquette University, has been publishing in mainstream academic journals on the subject of pre-Columbian contact since the 1970s. Her book, Travels in Pre-Columbian America, systematically documents the biological, archaeological, and linguistic evidence, and has been cited in peer-reviewed literature across multiple disciplines. She holds a doctorate from Harvard. She is not a crank. She is a scientist whose conclusions have been systematically excluded from the textbook consensus, not because her evidence has been refuted, but because her conclusions are institutionally inconvenient. Carl Johannesson, Professor Emeritus of Geography at the University of Oregon, spent 30 years documenting the distribution of pre-Columbian maize imagery in Old World temples, including the Hoysala carvings described in Chapter 3, and published over 20 peer-reviewed papers on the subject before his death in 2018. His methodology was rigorous, his documentation was meticulous, his work has never been formally disproven. It simply exists in a corner of the literature that the mainstream does not visit. These researchers are the reason this documentary exists. They did the work, they followed the evidence, and they did it knowing exactly what it would cost them. The single most powerful assumption sustaining the argument that ancient trans-oceanic contact was impossible is not a historical argument at all. It is a psychological one. The assumption that ancient peoples lacked the navigational capability to cross open oceans with intentionality and precision. Dismantling this assumption requires not just evidence but a fundamental rethinking of what navigation means and where the knowledge to navigate comes from. Polynesian star navigation is the best documented example of indigenous deep ocean wayfinding, and its sophistication remains genuinely humbling even for modern navigators with access to GPS. Polynesian navigators memorized the rising and setting points of over 200 stars on the horizon, organized into specific star paths, sequences of stars whose rising and setting directions corresponded to specific navigational bearings towards specific destinations. The star paths were not written down. They were held in the mind, maintained through oral training systems that began in childhood and took decades to master. With star paths alone, a navigator could maintain an accurate heading across thousands of miles of open ocean through any night with visible stars. But stars work only at night, and weather hides the sky. The daytime and overcast weather navigation systems were equally developed. Wave piloting the reading of ocean swells is perhaps the most extraordinary of these. Ocean swells are generated by storms thousands of miles away, and travel in predictable directions that change with the season and the region. When a swell encounters an island, it bends around the landmass, creating a characteristic pattern of disturbed and reflected waves that extends outward from the island like a signature. A trained wave pilot, lying in the hull of a vessel and feeling its motion through the water, could detect this signature up to 50 miles from land, well beyond the visual horizon. The island was invisible. The ocean remembered it anyway. The Marshall Islands stick charts, physical models woven from palm ribs, showing inter-island wave patterns with shells marking island positions are usually described as maps, but they were teaching tools rather than navigational instruments. You studied the chart on land to learn the patterns. You left the chart behind when you sailed. The knowledge was in the navigator's body. The Marshall Islands stick charts are, in a very real sense, the ocean's grammar written in palm and shell. A document of how deeply the human mind can be educated by the environment around it when the stakes of ignorance are drowning in open water. This matters for the broader argument in a simple but profound way. If Polynesian navigators could cross 3,000 miles of featureless Pacific with this degree of precision, then, The argument that ancient Atlantic or Indian Ocean navigators were incapable of extended open ocean passages rests on nothing more substantial than the assumption that Polynesian knowledge was somehow unique, that no other maritime culture ever developed comparable systems. It is an assumption that the evidence of this entire documentary systematically dismantles. The Phoenicians were the most accomplished sailors of the ancient Mediterranean world, and they remain the most underappreciated of all the ancient maritime civilizations in the popular imagination. Operating from their home cities of Tyre and Sidon on the Levantine coast of modern Lebanon, between approximately 1200 and 300 BCE, they founded Carthage in North Africa, established trading colonies in Spain, sailed regularly to Britain for tin, and created the phonetic alphabet that became the foundation of Greek, Latin, and ultimately every Western script in use today. Their commercial network was the most sophisticated in the ancient Mediterranean. Their navigational knowledge was the most extensive, and the evidence suggests their reach extended far beyond what official history credits them with. The most remarkable and most revealing account of Phoenician maritime capability comes from Herodotus, the Greek historian who is frequently described as the father of Western historical writing. In his histories, Herodotus records an account of a Phoenician fleet commissioned by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II around 600 BCE to circumnavigate the African continent, starting from the Red Sea, sailing south along the East African coast, rounding the southern tip of Africa, and returning via the Mediterranean. Herodotus records the account, and then, with a frankness that inadvertently confirms its authenticity, adds that he personally does not believe it, because the sailors reported that, as they rounded the southern tip of Africa and sailed westward, the sun was on their right hand. Herodotus, working from the perspective of the northern hemisphere, found this physically impossible. We, knowing what the southern hemisphere means, recognize it immediately. If you are in the southern hemisphere sailing west, the sun which moves through the northern sky is indeed to your right. Herodotus doubted the story because he couldn't understand it. We believe it for exactly the same reason. A civilization that circumnavigated Africa in 600 BCE had the navigational range to follow the West African coast southward, past the equator, to know the current system that runs westward from the Cape Verde Islands, and to ask what lay beyond it. Bronze coins of Phoenician and Carthaginian origin have been reported from multiple locations in the Americas, though their provenance is often disputed. The Paraíba stone of Brazil, discovered in 1872, and bearing what several epigraphers have analysed as a Phoenician inscription describing a voyage from the Red Sea around Africa, has been debated for over a century. Without resolution, with the original stone now lost but the transcription surviving. More recently, paleontologist Mark McMenamin at Mount Holyoke College conducted spectroscopic analysis of gold coins from Carthage, the Phoenician colony in North Africa, and found trace element compositions that he argued in a 1996. Conference proceedings matched Central American gold deposits rather than any Mediterranean source. If gold coins from Carthage were made from American gold, someone had to carry that gold across the Atlantic. The evidence is not conclusive, but it is specific, it is scientific, and it points toward a Phoenician navigational range that does not stop at the Pillars of Hercules. The Phoenicians kept their navigational knowledge as commercial secrets, jealously guarded trade intelligence that gave them competitive advantage over Greek and Roman merchants who operated in the same waters. They are known to have deliberately navigated into fog, run their vessels aground, and taken other risks to prevent competing ships from following their routes. A civilization willing to sink its own ships to protect a trade route has very good reasons for not writing down where those routes went. If the Polynesian achievement is humbling and the Phoenician record is suggestive, the Austronesian expansion is the most extraordinary and the most definitively documented case of ancient maritime capability on the planet, and it is not remotely controversial. It is mainstream science. It is taught in undergraduate archaeology courses. It is the baseline from which every other argument in this chapter proceeds. The Austronesian-speaking peoples originated in Taiwan approximately 5,000 years ago, and over the following millennia spread by sea across a range that eventually covered more than half the Earth's circumference. They settled the Philippine archipelago, then Indonesia, then the Pacific islands of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. They reached New Zealand in the south and Hawaii in the north. They made contact with the Americas, as established by the genetic and botanical evidence of Chapter 2. And in the opposite direction, they crossed the entire Indian Ocean and settled Madagascar, the large island off the southeast coast of Africa, sometime around 400 CE, a journey of over 4,000 miles across open ocean from their nearest Southeast Asian origin point in Borneo or Sulawesi. Madagascar is not a stepping stone journey. There are no intermediate islands of significance between Indonesia and Madagascar. The Austronesian settlers of Madagascar crossed the full width of the Indian Ocean, navigating through some of the world's most complex and changeable monsoon waters, and arrived in a place that no previous human population had ever reached. The language they brought with them, Malagasy, is demonstrably descended from the Barito languages of Borneo, confirming the origin point. The agricultural crops they brought, banana, coconut, taro, breadfruit, became fundamental to East African and Malagasy food systems. Austronesian loanwords are found throughout the Swahili language of the East African coast, attesting to centuries of trade and interaction that mainstream historians acknowledge but rarely emphasize. Now consider the geography. The Austronesians are in Madagascar, on the East African coast, at the western extreme of the Indian Ocean. They are also in Polynesia, on the Pacific coast of South America, at the eastern extreme of the Pacific. Their maritime network, at its maximum extent, wrapped more than halfway around the planet. The equatorial Atlantic current system runs directly from the West African coast, where Austronesian trade networks intersected with African coastal commerce, to the Caribbean and the Brazilian coast. To assume that Austronesian sailors, who crossed the entire Indian Ocean and the entire Pacific, never followed the Atlantic current system even a fraction of the way across the Atlantic, is to assume a very specific and very convenient limitation on their curiosity and their navigational capability. The argument is not that the Austronesians colonized the Americas via the Atlantic. The argument is simply that the most accomplished maritime expansion in human prehistory extended to both edges of the known world, and that the edges left very little room between them. Ancient people did not cross dangerous oceans for adventure or curiosity alone. The history of exploration is the history of commercial incentive, the search for things that are valuable because they cannot be found at home. The question of what motivated trans-oceanic contact, if it occurred at scale, is therefore not a romantic question about human courage. It is an economic question about supply, demand, and the willingness to accept risk in the service of profit. Consider what the Americas offered to a trader from the Old World. Coca, the plant that yields cocaine, had documented medicinal and stimulant properties that would have made it extraordinarily valuable in ancient pharmacological markets, as valuable as opium, as valuable as any spice in the Indian Ocean trade network. Tobacco was similarly pharmacologically active, and its effects on the nervous system would have made it as commercially compelling as any luxury good in the ancient world. Rubber available only from South American trees would have had applications in waterproofing, adhesives, and resilience that no Old World material could match. And gold. The Americas contained gold deposits of a scale and accessibility that dwarfed anything available in the Old World, as the Spanish discovered to their uncontained joy in the 16th century. None of these were available anywhere except in the Western Hemisphere. In the other direction, the Americas lacked several resources that the Old World possessed in abundance. Iron technology, the transformative metallurgical innovation that reshaped Old World civilization, had not developed independently in the Americas. The horse, which had been native to the Americas, but went extinct at the end of the last ice age, was absent. Certain grain crops, textile technologies, and writing systems existed in the Old World in forms not independently developed in the Americas. The commercial logic for trans-oceanic exchange, in both directions, was overwhelming. If both sides knew the other existed, there is one additional piece of this commercial picture that deserves mention, though it is not comfortable. The ongoing scientific debate about the geographic origin of syphilis, whether it arrived in Europe as part of the Columbian exchange, or whether it existed in the Old World before Columbus has direct bearing on contact. History. The Columbian exchange theory holds that Columbus's returning sailors brought syphilis back from the Americas, explaining the documented European epidemic that began in the late 1490s. But pre-Columbian European skeletal remains have been identified with bone lesions consistent with treponema, the syphilis bacterium raising the possibility of earlier contact events. The debate is genuinely unresolved. But in the context of everything else presented in this documentary, an earlier exchange of pathogens as well as plants fits the pattern of a world where the boundary between old and new was less absolute than we have been taught. 8 chapters of evidence: mummy toxicology and population genetics, the botanical record across 3 oceans, temple alignments and astronomical codes, ancient texts from India, China, and the Islamic world, linguistic correspondences that cross thousands of miles of water, the physical demonstrations of navigational capability, the documented cases of institutional suppression. If you have followed the argument to this point without being persuaded that something significant is being underrepresented in the conventional history of pre-Columbian contact, then the fault may lie with the presentation. But if you have followed the argument and found it compelling not in every particular, but in its cumulative weight and direction, then the question that presses forward is, what exactly needs to change about the story we tell? The revision required is not a wholesale demolition of conventional history. The Bering Land Bridge migration is real. The Norse settlement at Lanceau Meadows is real and documented. The independent development of civilization in the Americas, the Maya mathematical tradition, the Inca engineering, the Aztec astronomical knowledge was genuinely independent in its essential character. What the evidence in this documentary suggests is not that American civilizations were derivative of Old World ones, or that Old World civilizations secretly provided the foundations of everything in the Americas. It suggests something more interesting and more human than that. It suggests a world in which the great civilizations of the ancient period, Egyptian, Phoenician, Indian, Chinese, West African, Polynesian, were not sealed compartments, developing in isolation behind oceanic walls, but participants in a wider, messier, more intermittent conversation than we have acknowledged. Not a continuous, organized global trade network like the modern world possesses, but a world where exceptional individuals and groups, driven by commercial incentive or intellectual curiosity, or the specific combination of capability and accident that characterizes all exploration, occasionally crossed the water and occasionally came back with something, and where those crossings left traces in genes and plants and words and stone that are only now becoming legible to the scientific tools we have developed. The appropriate concept is not discovery, the triumphalist notion of one civilization finding another for the first time and naming it. The appropriate concept is contact, repeated, partial, multidirectional, sometimes sustained, and sometimes fleeting, leaving different kinds of evidence in different places, driven by the same commercial and human impulses that have always characterized the species that built boats. This is not a smaller story than the conventional one. It is a larger one, more complex, more human, more true to what we actually know about how people behave when there is an ocean in front of them and something of value on the other side. The institutional resistance described in Chapter 7 is real and ongoing. But science has a way of generating its own momentum, especially when the technology available to investigate a question advances faster than the paradigm's ability to suppress the answers. The past 2 decades have produced a series of scientific developments that are actively pushing the trans-oceanic contact question back into serious mainstream consideration, not through archaeology alone, but through the revolution in ancient DNA analysis that has been quietly rewriting human prehistory since approximately 2015. Full genome sequencing of ancient skeletal remains, made possible by advances in DNA extraction and sequencing technology that can recover and read genetic material from bones thousands of years old, has produced a stream of genetic results that have challenged existing migration models across the globe. In 2015, a landmark ancient DNA study revealed that the peopling of the Americas was more complex than any existing model had suggested, with evidence of multiple migration events and population contacts that the Bering Land Bridge model alone cannot account for. In 2021, analysis of ancient Amazonian skeletal remains found an Australasian genetic signal, genetic ancestry pointing to a population connection with Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians, in groups whose presence in the Parcatai Amazon predates any known contact event by thousands of years. The researchers who published this finding were cautious about its interpretation, as scientists should be. But the signal is in the data, and the data is peer-reviewed. LiDAR technology, aerial laser scanning that penetrates jungle canopy to reveal structures beneath, has in the past decade transformed our understanding of the scale of pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas. In Guatemala, LiDAR surveys of the Maya lowlands revealed a networked urban landscape of extraordinary density and complexity. Roads, canals, agricultural infrastructure, and city footprints connecting sites across thousands of square miles. The sheer scale of the civilization revealed by LiDAR, orders of magnitude larger than previous estimates, makes the idea of complete pre-Columbian isolation correspondingly harder to sustain. Civilizations of this scale do not develop in total informational isolation from the rest of the world. Underwater archaeology's expanding technological capability is opening frontiers that previous generations could not reach. Remote sensing technology and deep-water remotely operated vehicles have identified potential archaeological material on submerged continental shelves in the Indian Ocean, the North Sea, and the waters around Indonesia. The Arabian Gulf Shelf, which was above water and densely habitable until approximately 8,000 years ago, is being surveyed by teams from multiple countries. What they are finding: stone structures, possible tool assemblages, organic material susceptible to radiocarbon dating, is still in early stages of analysis. But the picture emerging from the seafloor is consistent with the picture emerging from the genetics lab and the jungle LiDAR survey. The ancient world was more populated, more connected, and more capable than the standard history has allowed. Pick up any high school history textbook from any country in the English-speaking world, open it to the chapter on the Americas before Columbus, and read carefully. In almost every case, you will find one of two things: a paragraph about the Bering Land Bridge migration and the major pre-Columbian civilizations, presented as a complete account of the Americas before 1492, or in more recently revised editions, an additional paragraph about the Viking settlement at Lansor Meadows in Newfoundland, presented as the single authenticated exception to the rule of pre-Columbian isolation. The Lansor Meadows detail is worth dwelling on, because it illustrates the cycle of denial and eventual acceptance that characterizes every challenge to the Columbian exceptionalism paradigm. The existence of Norse settlement in North America was proposed by Scandinavian scholars in the mid-20th century on the basis of the Norse sagas, written accounts describing voyages to a land called Vinland that matched North American geography in specific and testable detail. The proposal was dismissed by mainstream archaeology as legend-based speculation, despite the specificity of the saga accounts and the existence of Norse navigational capability to make the journey. In 1960, the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Steen Ingstad, excavated a site at the northern tip of Newfoundland and found the physical remains of a Norse settlement. Turf longhouses, ironworking evidence, wooden objects of Scandinavian type, and botanical remains all confirmed by radiocarbon dating to approximately 1000 CE. The saga accounts were accurate. The skeptics were wrong. The textbooks were updated. The pattern is clear: denial, based on the assumption that the evidence is insufficient; physical confirmation that forces acceptance; textbook revision. But the process takes decades, and in the interim, children are taught that something impossible happened, or rather, that something real was impossible, because the institutional machinery of academic publishing and educational curriculum takes generations to catch up with the evidence. The sweet potato, the haplogroup X genetic signal, the Balabanova cocaine mummies, the pre-Columbian chicken bones in Chile. These findings are in the academic literature. They have been published, replicated in some cases, and are known to researchers in the relevant fields. They are not in the textbooks. The cost of this gap is not merely academic. It means that indigenous peoples whose oral traditions describe contact with outsiders continue to have their historical memories dismissed as mythology. It means that the civilizational achievements of Polynesian navigators, West African maritime explorers, and ancient Indian and Chinese ocean sailors remain systematically absent from the story we tell children about who built the modern world. It means we are giving the next generation a smaller picture of human capability than the evidence supports. And small pictures of human capability tend to produce small ambitions about what is possible. There is an argument sometimes made against the pre-Columbian contact hypothesis that deserves direct attention, because it comes not from scientific skeptics, but from indigenous scholars and communities who have their own complex relationship with the history of who was in the Americas and when. The argument is this: claims of Old World contact with pre-Columbian America have historically been used, in some cases, to minimize indigenous achievement, to suggest that the great civilizations of Mesoamerica, South America, and North America could not have developed their sophistication without outside help. This concern is legitimate, historically grounded, and worth taking seriously. But it points toward a misunderstanding of what the Trans-Oceanic contact evidence actually implies. If taken on its own terms, rather than through the lens of the colonial mythology it disrupts, the evidence in this documentary does not suggest that indigenous American civilizations were dependent on Old World knowledge. The Maya independently developed the concept of zero, one of the most important mathematical innovations in human history, at roughly the same time as, or before, Indian mathematicians, and entirely separately. The Inca engineering tradition, the terraced agriculture, the road network, the stonework of Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman was not imported from anywhere. It was built by Andean people, using Andean knowledge developed over centuries. The Aztec astronomical calendar was not copied from China or Egypt. It was an independent achievement of remarkable precision. What the evidence suggests is that these achievements did not occur in a vacuum of total informational isolation. It suggests that the Americas were part of the wider human conversation, that traders and travelers, and occasionally shipwrecked sailors from other parts of the world, sometimes arrived, sometimes traded, sometimes stayed, sometimes left behind genetic material and plant species, and perhaps fragments of knowledge. This is additive, not subtractive. It treats indigenous American peoples not as isolated primitives waiting to be discovered, but as active participants in a global human story. Participants who were capable of engaging with outside contact on their own terms, integrating useful knowledge into their own developing traditions. The Lakota oral tradition includes accounts of visitors from across the Eastern Ocean, arriving in boats, trading, and departing. Historians have classified these accounts as mythology. But the same historians classified the Norse saga accounts of Vinland as mythology until the shovels at Lanceau Meadows made denial impossible. Indigenous oral traditions have been proven accurate by physical evidence, often enough in their accounts of geological events, animal extinctions, and geographical features that the assumption of their mythological status, rather than their historical status, requires better justification than simple institutional preference. When indigenous peoples say they remember contact, the question is not whether we believe them. The question is what it takes for the rest of the world to look. 9 chapters ago, we stood in a room in Constantinople in 1513 and watched a Turkish admiral trace coastlines onto sheepskin with an ink-stained hand. The mystery then was simple. How did he know the shape of a continent that, by official history, no human being would reach for another 300 years? The mystery now is larger not because we have answered it, but because we have assembled enough of the picture around it to understand what kind of answer it requires. The Piri Reis map is not a map that someone invented. It is a map that someone compiled. Piri Reis said so himself in his own marginal notes. He used source charts, charts he described as old, charts whose origins he traced to lost libraries and ancient collections that had survived the various catastrophes of the ancient world in scattered fragments. The Portolan chart tradition, the medieval system of navigational charts used by Mediterranean sailors that predates the recovery of classical Greek geographical knowledge in Europe, shows, in several examples, geographic accuracies that conventional European cartographic technology cannot explain. Coastlines too precisely drawn, island positions too accurately placed, continental outlines too correct to be derived from the sailing distances and compass bearings available to medieval European navigators. The implication is not that there existed a single lost civilization with global geographical knowledge. It is something more gradual and more human. That maritime knowledge of the world's shape accumulated over thousands of years, carried by navigators in many different traditions, passed between cultures at trading ports and in the libraries of ancient cities, and preserved imperfectly, in fragments, increasingly distorted as successive copyists misunderstood what they were copying until it surfaced in the work of a diligent Ottoman cartographer who had better access to ancient sources than anyone since the Library of Alexandria. In 2019, cartographic historian Dr. Gregory McIntosh published research tracing several of the cartographic traditions that Piri Reis incorporated into his map, identifying connections to a lineage of Ptolemaic cartography that itself incorporated pre-classical geographical knowledge, pushing the knowledge chain back toward the Bronze Age. This is careful, institutional scholarship. It is not fringe work. It suggests that the Piri Reis map is not an anomaly, but a window, the last surviving trace of a cartographic tradition that encoded knowledge accumulated by sailors who crossed the oceans long before the age we call the Age of Exploration. The map is a receipt. Someone made the journey. Someone came back, and someone, carefully and diligently, wrote down what they found. Imagine the world in approximately 1000 BCE, not the isolated, compartmentalized world of the standard history textbook, one civilization here, another there, each sealed behind oceanic boundaries, developing in blissful or terrible ignorance of the other's existence. Imagine instead a world alive with long-distance movement, rare, dangerous, intermittent, motivated by the same combination of commercial incentive and human curiosity that drives every voyage of exploration in every era. In Egypt, merchants and physicians are in possession of pharmaceutical materials whose chemical signatures match South American plants. Whether they understand the full geography of how those plants reached them is unclear. They may know only that certain trade goods arrive from the south and west via networks whose full extent no single individual maps. In Mexico, on the Gulf Coast, a civilization of sophisticated astronomers and engineers is building monumental ceremonial heads, some of them depicting faces that tell a story of contact with peoples from across the Atlantic whose identity has been lost. In the Pacific, outrigger canoes are making the journey to a large landmass to the east, trading sweet potatoes and stories, and returning with goods whose names will eventually become embedded in the language of the islands. In China, a scholar monk is preparing for an ocean journey that will consume 40 years of his life. Recording what he finds, in the methodical prose of a man who knows his account, will be filed in an imperial archive and read by court officials who care about accuracy. In West Africa, a tradition of deep-water sailing is building the knowledge and the vessels that will eventually carry an emperor across the Atlantic in a fleet whose fate remains one of history's most poignant mysteries. In India, shipbuilders are following engineering texts of extraordinary specificity, constructing vessels whose size and capability the standard history has consistently underestimated. And somewhere in a library in Carthage, perhaps, or in the cartographic collection of a Phoenician trading house, or in the memory of a navigator who has followed the Atlantic current far enough west to know that it does not run forever without making landfall, someone possesses, in fragmentary but real form, a map of the world that is more accurate than anything the mainstream of any era's scholarship would sanction. That map will be copied, and the copies will be copied, and errors will accumulate, and contexts will be lost. And the knowledge will thin and fragment across generations until, one winter evening in 1513, a Turkish admiral will spread a piece of sheepskin on a table and do his best to reconstruct, from the fragments he can gather, what the whole once looked like. Every element of this picture is anchored in the evidence presented in the preceding 9 chapters. This is not imagination. This is reconstruction from documented facts. And it is a far grander, more connected, more fully human story than the one we inherited. Evidence has been presented. Researchers have been named. The institutional mechanisms of suppression have been described honestly. The revised picture of the ancient world has been sketched as carefully as the available material allows. What remains, and it is worth stating directly, is the question of what the evidence demands from us in practical terms. First, dedicated investment in underwater archaeology. The physical record of ancient maritime civilization, the ports, the shipyards, the trading stations, the cartographic schools that would have preserved and transmitted ocean-crossing knowledge is primarily located along the coastlines that existed before the post-glacial sea level rise. Those coastlines are now underwater. Hundreds of thousands of square miles of once habitable, once navigated coastal terrain have never been surveyed for archaeological material because the technology has only recently become capable of doing so. A research investment in submerged coastal archaeology, comparable to what has been invested in Egyptian or Mesopotamian land sites, would, in all likelihood, produce transformative discoveries within a decade. The material is there. The technology exists. The only missing element is institutional will. Second, a formal, multidisciplinary academic review of the Trans-Oceanic contact evidence. Not a validation of any specific claim, and not a dismissal of the body of work as a whole, but a rigorous, funded, multidisciplinary assessment involving geneticists, botanists, linguists, archaeologists, and historians of what the accumulated evidence actually shows, what it rules out, what it supports, and what further investigation is warranted. This kind of systematic review is standard procedure in every other area of contested scientific evidence. Its absence from this particular field is the most telling indicator of how deeply the institutional resistance runs. Third, revision of educational curricula to reflect the genuine complexity and genuine uncertainty of pre-Columbian history. Not to teach contested hypotheses as established facts, but to teach the fact of ongoing scholarly debate, the existence of evidence whose implications have not been resolved, and critically, the oral traditions of indigenous peoples as historical sources deserving the same serious engagement we extend to ancient written records. Fourth and finally, recognition, explicit and sustained, of the civilizational achievements of non-European maritime cultures, Polynesian navigators, West African sailors, Arab geographers, Indian and Chinese ocean traders, as the intellectual and practical equals of European exploration in ambition, sophistication, and historical significance. The age of exploration that we celebrate was not the beginning of human beings venturing beyond the horizon. It was a resumption after a period of disconnection and loss of something that had been going on for a very long time. There is an image that exists in every culture that has ever lived near the sea. A human figure standing at the edge of land, looking out at the water. The horizon is visible, that clean, curved line where the ocean surface meets the sky, the edge of the known world, the beginning of everything uncertain. In every age, on every coast, across the entire span of human history, people have stood at that edge and asked the same question: what is out there? And in every age, on every coast, some of them went to find out. This is the simplest and most human argument in this entire documentary. It requires no genetic data, no toxicological analysis, no architectural comparison. It requires only the observation that the human species is, in its deepest behavioral character, an explorer, a creature that responds to the unknown with curiosity rather than terror, that moves toward horizons rather than away from them, that builds things that float and then puts them in the water to see where they go. This is not a modern characteristic. It is ancient as our species. The first people to reach Australia crossed open water to do it. The first people to settle the Pacific Islands chose an ocean over a shore. The first people to reach the Americas by whatever route or routes they took were not driven there by accident. They followed the evidence of land, the birds, the clouds, the current drift, the smell of vegetation on the wind. They knew, in the practical knowledge of experienced seafarers, that there was something beyond the horizon. They went to confirm what they already suspected. Return now, briefly, to each of the places this documentary has visited. A room in Constantinople, where an Ottoman admiral traces impossible coastlines onto sheepskin, working from charts he cannot fully explain. Egyptian mummies in museum cases whose preserved tissues carry chemical signatures from plants that grow 4,000 miles away, across an ocean that was supposedly not crossed for another 1,000 years. Stone heads on a Gulf Coast beach in Mexico, depicting faces whose features ask a question that nobody has found a comfortable way to answer. A 12th century temple in southern India, covered in botanical carvings, that several botanists have identified as corn, a plant that officially did not reach that continent for another 4 centuries. A Chinese imperial history recording, in the dry language of official chronicle, a Buddhist monk's 40-year stay in a land 7,000 miles to the east. A Malian emperor standing at the prow of a fleet 2,000 vessels strong, watching the African coast recede behind him, sailing toward whatever the horizon held. None of these images is invented. Each one is documented. Each one is a trace of the world that the evidence is trying to reconstruct. A world not of perfect isolation, interrupted by a single heroic European voyage, but of intermittent, imperfect, deeply human connection across distances that our species has never allowed to be permanent barriers. The ocean did not divide us. It never has. The horizon was not a wall. It was an invitation. And the people who came before us, long before the era we call history, long before the age we call exploration, accepted that invitation with the same audacity that built the first canoe and launched it into the first wave. We are all of us, every human being alive today, the descendants of people who looked at a horizon and chose to sail toward it rather than away from it. The distances were enormous. The knowledge was hard-won. The evidence is all around us, waiting to be read. This documentary has been their story, a story that was never lost, only submerged, and the tide, very slowly, is going out. The research continues. The ancient DNA keeps returning results that the textbooks haven't incorporated yet. The LiDAR keeps revealing cities in the jungle that nobody knew were there. The underwater survey teams keep finding structures on the continental shelves that the sea swallowed 12,000 years ago. The evidence keeps accumulating, patiently, in journal papers and laboratory reports and museum drawers, building toward the moment when the weight of it becomes impossible to carry without putting it down into a revised story of who we are. That moment is coming. It may already be here. The ocean keeps its secrets close, but not forever.